The second to last lecture of our extended closure, course finish to the 2020 school year due to the coronavirus pandemic. Again, kids, I apologize for the amount of lecture you've gotten, but my time has been limited. I've had time constraints, so I feel like I have to lecture more than I would like to just try and expose you to several different elements of American history. And there's still so much stuff that's being left out that I'm really kind of frustrated, because I think the study of American history is incredibly important. It helps you understand your country, but also each other better and all the various people within it. So I'm frustrated that we can't be discussing these issues in depth, and I'm frustrated that we can't be dealing with so many different things. There's things that we should be dealing with that we can't. And really what you're kind of getting is the basics here. So hopefully some of you will be able to take more American history in the future and learn some more stuff in depth and learn other things, because there's a lot of great aspects to it. But today I'm going to focus on foreign policy under Reagan and Bush. I will be addressing some domestic policies of Reagan, just to once again expose you to some different things. So Ronald Reagan is pictured here. He'll be president from 81 to 89. His vice president, George H.W. Bush, will take over after, and he'll be president from 89 to 93. And then this other man pictured here is Mikhail Gorbachev, who will be the last premier of the Soviet Union. As one of the topics I'll be dealing with in this lecture is the end of the Cold War, and these three men will be pivotal in bringing that about. The primary sections from your text that I'm using for this lecture are 12.6 and then 17.4 through 6, and then some other resources as well. Now, 17.4 does a really good job with talking about conservative beliefs and the rise of the new right. So I wanted to take a moment to review the beliefs of the two political parties, because I really think it's important for young Americans to learn that as they grow up and develop their own political beliefs. So this is a political spectrum. I may have shown you something like this earlier in the year, or at least drawn something like this on the board, but this is one I got from an online government textbook. So this is a political spectrum as it relates to the United States. Now, a spectrum is an array of beliefs. Okay, so a spectrum would be like an array of beliefs. So if you look at the United States, right, our two key political parties, our two main political parties are Democrats and Republicans, right? Democrats are labeled towards the left. Republicans are considered right-wing. Okay, so they lean towards the right. And then, of course, we have the center, which is really where most Americans exist. Most Americans tend to exist in here. Most Americans like some things that Republicans believe, and most Americans like something that Democrats believe. And of course, you have Americans who are fully committed one way or the other. It's important to point out when you look at these two parties that the Democratic Party is the party that tends to advocate change more. They're more of a reform-based party. They believe that there are wrongs in American society that need to be corrected, and they believe that their democratic government, their elected officials, should be actively trying to address those wrongs and remove them from American society. Republicans tend to be more status quo, meaning they like the way the system currently is and they fear changing it. They don't want it to change too much, because then they fear it may not be what it once was. And when you listen to the arguments, like of what I just told you, nothing I just said is wrong. It's just difference of philosophy, but perhaps the same goal, to create a great democracy. Now, what can be wrong is if you have beliefs that go too far one way or the other. If you have extreme right wing, that could turn into dictatorship. That can lead to fascism. If you have extreme left wing, that can turn into dictatorship. That can lead to communism, totalitarian communism. And when those philosophies happen, quite frankly, people die, right? What we see is human rights violations, civil rights violations, political rights violations, social rights violations. What we see is the state is in complete control, and people's lives are subject to the state, and they have no say in it. So what we want to do is avoid those two extremes. The strength of the two-party system is that those extremes do not occur. If Democrats tend to go too far left, the Republicans are supposed to pull them back. If the Republicans tend to go too far right, the Democrats are supposed to pull them back. That is the strength of our system. Let's address what these two sides believe, and then we'll get into the historical content of this lecture. Now, I had to go back into some previous chapters of your text. Your text actually does a better job of explaining conservative beliefs than I think it does liberal ones. If you look at 17.4, your text does a really good job with conservative beliefs. Some really nice explanation there. They could do a better job with the left, in my opinion. But what I did is I went back to the Progressive Era chapter, went and looked at the New Deal chapter with Roosevelt, okay? And then, of course, I looked at the New Left in the 1960s, which we've recently studied. And maybe you remember reading some of these things with Miss Edmondson when you were a freshman and you spent a lot of time on the progressive movement, or at least you should have. But what progressives and liberals tend to believe in is protecting social welfare. So a liberal tends to want to help the poor. They want to help the disadvantaged. They want to help those who they believe have been exploited by the abuses of society, whether it be greed, racism, sexism, things like that. So they want to help people who have been taken advantage of due to the evils of society, quite frankly. And they believe that government should be actively trying to address those evils. They want to promote moral improvement. They want to provide opportunities for people to improve themselves. And that can be in a lot of different areas. And to improve yourself might mean job training, right? To improve yourself might be alcoholism or drug addiction rehab. Liberals tend to support those things. They want to create economic reform. They want more equal distribution of wealth. They want to reduce income inequality. They want to reduce corruption in politics. So they want economic reform. They're not happy with the idea that that so much of the nation's wealth is concentrated in the top 10% of the United States. They'd like to see that spread out more evenly. They want to foster efficiency. This deals with the workplace. So they want a productive workplace, but they want a safe workplace. They want to limit hours. They want the 40-hour work week. They want overtime. They want benefits and good pay. They want to limit the power of corporations. What really drove a lot of the protests of the New Left was the fact that the corporations seemed to be having more of a say in government policy than the people did. So they want to limit the power of corporations and its influence over government. They want a more participatory democracy. They favor high voter turnouts. They want to enforce the Voting Rights Act in 1965. They want government to represent the will of the people, at least from their viewpoint. They want the government to reflect the will of the people. Well, for that matter, they just want the government to reflect the voting population. Okay, once again, I said 17.4 does a good job with conservatives and the new right. A lot of good things in there. I encourage you to read that section. You'll gain a lot more understanding of the things I'm trying to bring up in this lecture if you read those things. But basically what conservatives and the new right believe in that evolved into really the movement that led to the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 is what they believed in is shrinking the size of the federal government. Remember, Ford and Carter dealt with this a little bit too. They were concerned about too many government regulations, and they wanted to take a look at those regulations and leave the ones that were needed and remove the ones that perhaps were not. Okay? Conservatives believe in that. They believe that the federal government has gotten too big. They want to see more power in the hands of state and local governments, and they want to reduce the spending of the federal government. They want to promote family values and patriotic ideals. Now, once again, that family value, that's that traditional family model. They want mom and dad and kids, man, woman, stay together, avoid divorce, those types of things. So it's that traditional family model. And this is sometimes a source of contention these days, and that they don't seem to be as accepting as other family models as they are in promoting the traditional one. And they promote patriotic ideals. Now, those patriotic ideals tend to mean that they might be against a lot of elements of protest if that protest is seen as perhaps hurting the war effort, for example. So they want to promote patriotic ideals, support your government, support your president. They want to stimulate business by reducing government regulations and lowering taxes. Already kind of mentioned this, but they want to make sure that the opportunity to have a business in the United States is always there, that it's a good opportunity if someone wants to start a small business. They don't have to pay too much in taxes, and they don't have to face too many government regulations. Once again, some government regulations can be good. You want to have a safe workplace, for example, but if there's too many of them, it can be hard for businesses to profit. And that could affect how much they can pay their employees as well. So, once again, both sides tend to make good arguments. Often the answer is sometimes in the middle. And conservatives tend to very much believe in strengthening national defense. They tend to advocate huge defense spending budgets. They want a powerful military to not only protect the United States, but further U.S. interests abroad. Okay, that brings us to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's election in 1980 will kind of be driven by the New Right movement. He'll be seen as solidifying that New Right movement. A little bit of background on him is he was an actor. He appeared in 50 movies from 1937 to 1964, so a pretty busy actor, right? He was governor of California from 1967 to 1975. He has a high rating as a president, and I think that is deserved. Now, the reason why I think that is deserved is for a few different reasons. One is the third bullet that you see here. One of the reasons he's highly rated as a president is because he was a great communicator. He had been an actor, he'd been on TV a lot. He was very comfortable in front of the camera, very comfortable speaking to people, gave good speeches, and he had a way of getting the American people, a majority of the American people, not everyone, of course, but a majority of the American people to support his policies, to support him, and most importantly, to believe in their country again. And that was really important coming out of the Vietnam War era. Remember, things were very divided during the Vietnam War era. In the 70s, Ford and Carter tried to get the country unified again and believing in itself again, so to speak. But they faced some pretty strong obstacles in doing that, and quite frankly, just weren't as effective at that as Reagan was. Reagan was effective at doing that. So that's one of the reasons why he's highly rated as a president, is he got the American people believing in their country again. He said to the American people, we are not becoming a second-rate world power. He told them that. And there was some fear that the United States was becoming a second-rate world power because they just lost the Vietnam War, right? I mean, they lost to North Vietnam and Viet Cong guerrillas. What major power loses to a force like that, right? So there was some concern that the United States was becoming a second-rate world power, and Reagan will take steps to make sure that that is not the case, that the United States is clearly a first world power. So I think that's another thing that lends to his greatness. And then the other thing that lends to his greatness is the steps he takes to end the Cold War. Now, he won't be the president during the end of the Cold War. That actually will be George H.W. Bush. But the steps that Reagan takes to help bring about its end are definitely key. And I think that lends itself to his greatness as well, and why he'll be a two-term president who will win elections by large margins. Now, having said that, there are things to criticize, of course. There are criticism of every president, and I do think Reagan is overrated. Now, what I mean by that is this. I think he deserves a very high rating. I think he was a good president, but he's overrated a little bit, and that we tend to look at him as a saint these days who did nothing wrong. The Iran-Contra scandal occurred while he was president. He left us with the highest deficit since World War II. He appealed to Southern segregationists a little bit in some of his early speeches when he talked about outside agitators and states' rights and things like that. So he did a little bit of that Nixon Southern strategy that I really find uncomfortable when I read some of his speeches. He doesn't enforce the Voting Rights Act in 1965 as much as it should be enforced. Black voter turnout declines while he's president. So there are definitely some things to criticize, and his economic policies will leave us some of the income inequality that we're currently dealing with, even in good times. That begins in the Reagan era with his tax cuts that benefit mostly the rich. They benefit everybody, his tax cuts, but mostly the rich, and that's one of the reasons why we have some of these income inequality issues that we have today. So there are things to criticize, but good president. I think it's fair to say that. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the 1980 election. Reagan was excellent at televised debates. You can imagine that an actor would be, right? A guy who appeared in 50 movies. There's some key debate moments in United States history, and if this lecture wasn't going to be too long, I'd show you this clip. I encourage you to take a look at these clips, see what good a speaker Reagan was, but I'm not going to show you any of these due to the length of this lecture. But I will post a PDF version of this lecture if you want to watch some of these video clips. But there's a clip in here where Reagan asks in a debate with Jimmy Carter on October 28th of 1980, and he asks the audience, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" And to many people, even if they like Carter, and a lot of people like Jimmy Carter, there's a lot to like about the guy, but even if they like Carter, they couldn't say that. So that was, I think, a key factor. That moment was key. You know what? I'm not better off. Think what was going on in the late 70s: inflation, the oil crisis, the Iran hostage crisis. All of that went against Jimmy Carter, and Reagan's popularity and his personality are going to help him win election by a pretty large margin. He's going to win the popular vote by 50.8% to 41%, and that translates to, and this comes up here, a very large electoral college victory. So you see all the states in red that Reagan won in 1980. So that's a pretty significant victory in 1980. Now, I do want to point out on this poster here, I think this is very relevant for us in our current times. You might notice this phrase here, "Let's make America great again." Donald Trump was not the first president to use that phrase. Reagan was, unless there's a president before who did that. I don't recall one. Historians have a lot of, I myself, other historians, they really struggle with that phrase, and I'll explain why in a moment. But in some respects, Reagan, it made more sense for him to use it, right? Because it's coming out of the 70s and the Vietnam War and the discontent and division that existed, in some of this in the 60s and 70s, and some protests that got out of control, and the Iran hostage crisis once again didn't go well. So in some respects, Reagan making that phrase maybe makes more sense. I'm not sure how it made sense for Trump in 2016 when we were in an economic boom. President Obama just brought us out of the Great Recession, but it seemed to work for his supporters. The reason why historians struggle with that phrase is because when you use it, what type of America are you referring to? Are you referring to the 50s and the suburban growth America? That's probably what Reagan was referring to, but even that decade has its share of issues. I mean, that decade was the beginning of the civil rights movement. That decade, the United States was incredibly segregated. Lynching was a common occurrence, So what America are you referring to here? Just white suburban America? So that phrase can be very problematic when a politician uses it. Okay, so historians tend to think of, American historians tend to think of America as a great country with some great ideals. There's just challenges we have to overcome. So we really don't like it when they say, "Let's make America great again." What's that mean? Anyway, okay, so Reagan's vision. So Reagan had an economic policy that became known as Reaganomics. Basically, what he wanted was smaller government, less government spending. He wanted to revive the U.S. economy. He wanted to balance the budget. And, oh yeah, communism was wrong. Reagan is going to actively seek to win the Cold War and end communism. He just believes communism is fundamentally wrong. There's nothing right about it. So that's his vision. The reality, so what happens under Reagan? I've got the word reality here. So his vision was, balanced budget, things like that. He will provide a huge tax cut for the American people. The Congress will reduce taxes 25% over 3 years. Now, those tax cuts will once again benefit the upper class more than anyone else, but it will benefit the other classes as well. And when we say that, what we're saying is the upper class had more percentage of a tax cut than the middle class did. So the middle class still had a nice tax cut under Reagan, but the upper class is still getting a larger percentage. And sometimes economists and historians have issues with that because that leads to cuts in other areas. So that leads to cuts in social programs. So for instance, what Reagan would like to do was cut programs that benefited the poor while trying to avoid programs that benefited the middle class. Liberals have a problem with that because you're making it even tougher for the poor to get out of their circumstance if they're at least trying to, right? So if you cut Medicaid, you're only hurting the poor more. That happened under Reagan. Okay, you shouldn't have to cut those programs if you're reducing taxes. Okay, or you might have to cut those programs if you reduce taxes and you have a major defense buildup. And this is one of the legacies of Reagan. One of the legacies of Reagan is, well, we have to have a huge military. We've got to fund the military. So when we do cut stuff, we're going to cut domestic programs. So for example, people say, well, we can't provide health care to everyone. Economists, historians will argue, well, we could. if we, didn't always have a major defense buildup. That actually we could do it quite well. But the legacy of Reagan is, well, we don't want to not support the military, so we're going to cut social programs, and we're going to argue over those. Like we're going to threaten to cut in Social Security to make sure that the military has, a lot of stealth bombers. So those are some of the criticisms that occur to that. Now, there are advantages, of course, to big military. Defense, furthering interests, and the jobs that it provides. There are advantages to that, but they can lead to other cuts in programs that could benefit people, once again, healthcare. And also, it creates huge deficits. So we have a huge deficit, and poverty actually increased under Reagan. So the poor had it bad. What we see under Reagan is that phrase, the poor getting poorer and the rich getting richer. We see that under him. But we do see a good economy for most of the Reagan years, although he will leave and Bush will have to deal with a recession, his successor. Okay, on to foreign policy. All right, so I want to spend a good portion of the rest of this lecture dealing with the end of the Cold War. So I got to go back a little bit and look at some previous presidents. So I want to go back to Nixon again. Nixon will develop a policy based on two terms of the Cold War. Now, of course, remember, he's dealing with the end of the Vietnam War, or he's trying to end the Vietnam War while he's president. He'll be president from 69 to 74 when he resigns from Watergate, remember. In his dealings with China and the Soviet Union, there'll be two key terms, and that is realpolitik and détente. Now, realpolitik is a term created by his Secretary of State, person in charge of foreign policy, Henry Kissinger. And what Kissinger said is, we've got to base our foreign policy on consideration of power, not ideals or principles, right? Like we can't be so committed to containment that we get involved everywhere. We have to be more practical. He and Nixon were trying to end the Vietnam War. They were just having a really tough time doing it because they wanted to end with the appearance of victory, and that just wasn't happening. So realpolitik was kind of a way to end containment in terms of getting involved in all these countries that didn't really have much to do with our interests. Let's focus on countries that we can reduce tension with and further our interests. And one of those was China. Now, I notice I also said reduce tensions. That's what détente means. Détente means an easing of tensions. And what Nixon does is he visits China in 72, I believe it was. Sorry, I don't have the year here, kids. But he visits China and he creates a normalized relations with China. He recognizes communist China. The United States had refused up to this point to even recognize the existence and do business with or negotiate with communist China. Nixon changes that. So that is known as an easing of tensions. And what does that lead to? That leads to some agreements concerning Taiwan. That leads to better economic relations, better trade. And China has been a strong trading partner ever since. There are, of course, some tensions at times in terms of trade. There have been some recently, okay, but they've been a strong trading partner ever since. And maybe in the 80s, too strong, as we lost several jobs, several of our companies moved over to China. But nevertheless, this is an easing of tensions. Nixon will also be the first president to visit the Soviet Union, and while he's there, he will sign with Leonid Brezhnev, he will sign the SALT I Treaty, which limits the number of ICBMs. ICBMs are intercontinental ballistic missiles, and submarine-launched missiles that each side could produce. So reducing the amount of weapons that each side is producing and reducing the amount of nuclear weapons that each side is producing. And that'll stay until effect until Reagan, and then we'll see an explosion of nuclear arms weapons again. But nevertheless, trying to ease tensions. So that was Nixon's approach to the Soviet Union and China. Ford's only going to be president for 2.5 years, remember, because he takes over when Nixon resigns. He's going to basically continue Nixon's policy of détente and negotiation. The crowning achievement of the Ford presidency is the Helsinki Accords. The Helsinki Accords happened in November of 1974. 35 nations met in Helsinki, Finland, including the Soviet Union, and they signed a series of agreements that promised greater cooperation between the nations of Eastern and Western Europe. So once again, an easing of tensions. Let's talk about stuff instead of fight about stuff. Now, not everything goes smoothly for Ford concerning the Cold War. Your textbook talks about a crisis in Angola. Angola is a country on the western coast of Africa. It had been recently freed from Portuguese control in 1974. Here we see a surrogate conflict, meaning the United States supported the non-communist forces there. The Soviet Union supported the communist forces there. Ford will send funds to the non-communist forces there in their basically civil war. Sound familiar? Vietnam, right? Against the communist forces in Angola. Ford will request additional funds. He's not sending in troops, but he will request additional funds, and Congress will say no. So this is a little bit of that Vietnam syndrome. Congress does not want another Vietnam to begin. So the Soviet forces, or the forces that seem to be Soviet-backed or communist in nature, will win in Angola because Congress says to Ford, hey man, we're just not doing this again. We've learned our lesson from Vietnam. And Ford, to his credit, didn't want to send troops in. He did want to provide more money, but Congress didn't even want to do that. Okay, Carter. So Carter, one thing to remind you of with his foreign policy, and really this is one of the reasons why I think, even though he was only a one-term president and he had some serious problems to deal with as president and the Iran hostage crisis and all that hurts his legacy, I think one of the reasons why his legacy has improved, according to some recent interpretations, is because of his devotion to human rights, the devotion to the idea that who we interact with and how we dictate our foreign policy is going to be based on bettering not just the lives of American citizens, but the lives of citizens of this world. I think that is something that is much admired with Jimmy Carter over his years really on this earth, because he's been promoting that in his post-presidency years as well. And I think that really helps his reputation, quite frankly, as a human being and a leader, and that he's so devoted to human rights. And that's a break with realpolitik. Realpolitik said, we're not going to worry about human rights. We're going to negotiate with people to further our own interests. Carter's not going to be that way. Carter is like, we're going to negotiate with people to further our own interests, but we're going to influence them to be better with their civil human rights records. And we're not going to work with people who have human rights violations, which that can be limiting in foreign policy, and some of you pointed that out in your homework question, but it is also a noble way to approach foreign policy and how we often try to sell ourselves, right? This is how we sell ourselves when we get involved. Hey, we're going over here to further democracy. So at least Carter was really trying to stick to that. But that did lead to a breakdown in détente because Carter was unhappy about the Soviet Union's treatment of dissidents. Now a dissident is someone who opposes government policy. Soviet Union, if you oppose their policy, you're going to be imprisoned, you're going to be sent to Siberia, you're going to be executed. So he was not big on détente because of that type of treatment of people within the Soviet Union. And that'll hurt the SALT II talks. Now remember, SALT stands for Strategic Arm Limitation Talks. Carter's concern about human rights and the treatment of dissidents in the Soviet Union caused him to delay the SALT talks, but they do eventually occur in 1979, and they limited the number of strategic weapons and nuclear missile launchers that each side could produce. Sorry, kids, I'm doing this in one take, and it's getting late, so I apologize for screwing up occasionally here. And this will also lead to the 1980 Olympic boycott. So Carter's concern about Soviet Union and its human rights, its treatment of dissidents, will lead to the 1980 Olympic boycott. But the main reason for the 1980 Olympic boycott is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, which had been run by a communist government for years, but there was a rebel group fighting against that communist government in Afghanistan, known as the Mujahideen. The Soviet Union goes in to try and put down the Mujahideen and make sure that the Soviet-based government, the communist-based government in Afghanistan, stays in power. They will be unsuccessful at this. They will be involved in this conflict for 10 years. They will have to pull out without victory. Sometimes the Soviet involvement in Afghanistan is compared to the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Should have been easy. You think they would have gone in and just put down the Mujahideen and left. The United States should have just been able to go into Vietnam, put down the Viet Cong, and get out. Great powers. It didn't work out that way for either of them. They were both defeated essentially by guerrilla forces. Now, interestingly enough, just like the Soviet Union was giving weapons to the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong in the Vietnam War, the United States was giving weapons to the Afghan rebels in the Afghanistan War against the Soviet Union. And once again, this rebel group was known as the Mujahideen. One of the leaders or one of the participants in that rebel movement will be Osama bin Laden. So at one time, we were giving weapons to Osama bin Laden in his fight in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, and later he will go on to plan the 9/11 attacks against us. A little interesting tidbit and a sad tidbit in American history that maybe you've heard of. Now, this 1980 Olympic boycott, you can imagine how tough it was on these kids. Think how hard some of you are athletes. Think of what just happened to, you spring athletes who just got denied your track and your baseball season, right? Very sad. Very sad that just happened to you because of this pandemic. Imagine being an Olympian and you're training for 4 years, and the Olympics only happens every 4 years. You've trained your whole life. It's so hard to get in the Olympics. And Carter decides to boycott it. Oh, that was so tough on these kids. I don't know if you can argue if it was the right or wrong thing to do. There are arguments either way. But so tough on these Olympic athletes. And Carter felt bad. He met with them. But what a tough decision. What a tough decision. Interestingly enough, in 1984, the Soviet Union will boycott Olympics held in the United States. So, okay. All right, and that brings us to Reagan. Okay, so Ronald Reagan, once again, is going to be president from 1981 to 1989. He's going to end detente. And maybe that kind of ended under Carter anyway, but he really doesn't believe in that. Communism is evil. He's going to take a more confrontational approach to the Soviet Union. He's going to call the Soviet Union the evil empire. Okay, he's going to increase that defense budget by 25%. And this is, in some respects, this is what I mean by when you talk about Reagan's high ranking as a president. It's troubling that he's increasing the deficit of the United States by doing this, but it is somewhat of an effective strategy. Well, it is an effective strategy against the Soviet Union because by increasing the U.S. defense budget, increasing nuclear weapons, which can be scary, that there's a lot of nuclear weapons that exist, but by doing that, he forces the Soviet Union to do the same thing. He forces the Soviet Union to keep up. And the Soviet Union doesn't have the economy to keep up. They don't have the access to resources and money that the United States does. And so by the Soviet Union trying to keep up with U.S. weapons buildup, that's going to literally bankrupt the Soviet economy. It's going to be one reason for reform and collapse that occurs in the Soviet economy. It's going to be a key factor in the United States winning the Cold War. Now, there are consequences to this. Incredible budget deficit. A lot of nuclear weapons exist in the world, and right now our current security challenge is to make sure that none of those weapons fall in the hands of terrorists, because a lot of them exist. But what was going on here was the concept of mutually assured destruction. It's this notion that I have to match my enemy's weapons. I have to have as many nuclear missiles as that guy, or he's going to have first strike capability. So if the United States has 1,000 nuclear missiles, the Soviet Union is going to want to have 1,000 nuclear missiles. Because if the United States has 1,001, then they might be able to launch first. This is a phrase known as mutually assured destruction, meaning we're not going to launch if we're even. All right, so we have to keep up with each other. So Reagan kept building, and that drove the Soviet Union to bankruptcy. Well, at least that was an effect of it. Now, he also proposed something known as SDI, which stands for Strategic Defense Initiative. Had a nickname of Star Wars, right? Star Wars is popular in this era, still popular now. Okay, Strategic Defense Initiative. This was literally satellites that were going to be developed that could supposedly shoot nuclear missiles out of the sky. It never really was feasibly practical. It was just a theory, and it would have been tremendously expensive, so it didn't happen. But the Soviet Union was really threatened by this because they viewed SDI. Reagan tried to sell it as defensive. The Soviets viewed it as offensive because if the United States has a defensive capability against nuclear missiles, then they can definitely launch first. So all these things are key to the Soviet Union trying to keep up with us militarily, which will bankrupt or be one of the factors that bankrupts their economy. Now, the other key factor in the Cold War is Reagan's relationship with Mikhail Gorbachev. They actually developed a friendship and a mutual respect for each other. They will meet several different times, and that will lead to an easing of Cold War tensions. Just a little bit about Mikhail Gorbachev. He was born into a peasant family. He had a long career in politics. Quite frankly, he believed, even though he was a member of the Communist Party, he believed in democracy. And sometimes communism isn't totally antithetical to democracy. Like there are people who call themselves democratic communists. And maybe that's what Gorbachev was, because he believed in democratic reform and he's going to implement some democratic reforms when he becomes leader of the Soviet Union. They're also going to negotiate, and you see them negotiating here, the INF Treaty, which is an intermediate range nuclear forces treaty, which I'll define a little bit later in this lecture. Okay, so how key is Gorbachev? Gorbachev becomes General Secretary of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union in 1985, and he becomes head of state in 1988. So the full-on leader of the Soviet Union. He's the head of the Soviet Party, or the Communist Party, and he's head of state in 1988 through 1981. He's going to inherit a poor economy. Some of that might be due to the weapons buildup that they're being forced to keep up with the United States. You see that here, faced with pressure of the nuclear arms race. So he's going to inherit a poor economy. When the economy's poor, people tend to want change. Gorbachev actually believes in change. He's going to propose two things. So two key terms to associate with Gorbachev. Glasnost, which means openness. He's going to allow for freedom of the press and criticism of the government. It doesn't usually happen in a totalitarian communist state. Freedom of the press and criticism of the government. The press up to this point was state-run. Gorbachev is allowing for criticism of the government. Interesting. He's going to allow for perestroika, which is a restructuring of Soviet society. What does that mean? Less government control of the economy, some private enterprise, steps towards democratic government. So basically what Gorbachev is doing is allowing for less of a command economy in the Soviet Union and more of a market economy, more of a free market economy. Remember, a command economy is when the government makes the economic decisions. A free market economy is when people and private businesses make economic decisions. Gorbachev is starting to allow that to happen here while also allowing for freedom of press. Okay, I mentioned that he met with Reagan several times. In 1987, they meet at several different conferences while Reagan was president, and they signed an INF treaty. INF stands for Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces. Okay, so these are intermediate range nuclear missiles. They'll ban these in 1987. So these are missiles that you can place closer to enemy soil. They're more strategic. They're easy to remove. They're more first strike capability, I guess you could say. The INF is removing those. And this will lead to, this is a very successful treaty, this will lead to more than 2,500 missiles that'll be destroyed under this treaty. And Reagan's diary was later released after he passed away, and you read his diary entries in these years, and he is very concerned, like he's literally having nightmares about nuclear warfare. Perhaps some guilt about nuclear buildup later in his presidency was existing with Ronald Reagan. Thing is, though, Gorbachev wanted to go farther than Reagan. There was a meeting in Reykjavik, Iceland, in which Gorbachev met with Reagan, and Gorbachev said to Ronald Reagan, "Why are we stopping here? Let's get rid of all of them. Let's work to rid the world of nuclear weapons." And Reagan was taken aback. He didn't know how to respond. He knew his followers wouldn't go that far. He knew his supporters. He knew his business interests. There's profit wrapped up in the making of weapons. He basically knew he couldn't do that, but Gorbachev was willing to. Other thing to mention when you're talking about the end of the Cold War, of course, is the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1987, and there's a clip of this here if you want to watch it later in the PDF version. Just copy and paste this link. But one of Reagan's more famous speeches, and he gave a lot of good speeches. His speech after the Challenger explosion is fantastic too. I don't have that in here, but Reagan urges Gorbachev he goes to East Berlin. Remember, Germany is divided, right? There's East and West Germany. Berlin is in East Germany. Berlin is the capital of Germany, but it's in East Germany. the communist part of Germany. Berlin, even though it's in East Germany, is divided itself. You've got a West Berlin and an East Berlin. West Berlin is capitalist, considered part of West Germany. East Berlin is the communist part. There's a wall that divides the city. Okay, Reagan goes to Berlin. He gives a speech in front of that wall, and he says to Gorbachev, "Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Gorbachev may have already been taking steps to do so at this point, but Reagan's speech is going to kind of seen as further encourage that. Gorbachev was already encouraging the peoples of East Germany and Eastern Europe to go their own ways. He reduces the troop presence in Eastern Europe. He's starting to encourage democracy. Many of the peoples in these countries themselves are demanding democracy. There's a movement in Poland called Solidarity, which is a labor movement demanding economic reform. Okay, they're demanding democracy. So Eastern Europe is starting to pull away from the Soviet Union. On November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Walls opened. Kids, there's a great clip of the news coverage of this you might want to watch once again in the PDF version. I remember watching this. I was a freshman in college. This was just a revolutionary thing to see. I remember it was a big deal. Now, when this happens, Reagan is no longer president. When the Berlin Wall comes down, now Reagan's speech is definitely key to that. We can't take away from that. But George H.W. Bush, he put pressure on Gorbachev to bring that wall down too. He put pressure on the East German leadership to bring that down too. So I think sometimes Bush's efforts get overlooked. I mentioned that Reagan can be an overrated president. Sometimes I think George H.W. Bush is underrated. He's only president for 4 years. I think sometimes people forget his efforts to help end the Cold War as well. He had to deal with a recession. I'm going to mention the Persian Gulf War in a moment. I think Bush was also more of a civil rights president than Reagan. If you read John Meacham's book about Bush, your appreciation of him will grow. Good man. Didn't agree with everything he did, of course, but definitely an underrated president. And like Carter, I think Bush's rating as a president has increased some in recent interpretations. Now, Bush also had to deal with communism in China. I don't know how much he had to do with this outside of economic sanctions placed on China after this event. But this is really kind of a horrible event that occurs in China, the Tiananmen Square incident. So there are some reforms going on in China by 1989. China had loosened some price controls. Once again, some free market reform, maybe learning from Gorbachev a little bit. Less of a command economy. China still claims to be communist today, but there's a lot of free market capitalism going on in China today. They're definitely not as communist as they used to be. That reform was starting to happen in 1989. They had loosened some price controls, some of its grips on businesses. People wanted more. The protests, students, like the United States, students are idealistic. College students in China, in Tiananmen Square, which is a huge square in Beijing, these protests became huge. So students began demanding freedom of speech. They began demanding democracy, elections, things that people tend to want. They want to have a say in how their government rules them, quite frankly. These protests became huge demonstrations. They went on for 2 months. They began in early April. 1 million protesters will participate in the Tiananmen Square protests that began, I want to say, April 4th, 1989. The Chinese students even constructed a version of the Statue of Liberty during this 2-month protest. Tragically, China's premier, Li Peng, ordered the military to crush the protesters. China's armed forces literally slaughtered unarmed students in this incident. 250,000 troops were sent in. Hundreds to thousands of protesters were killed. Imagine the government firing on, your own. Well, I guess it happened at Kent State, but this was much greater than Kent State. 10,000 will be arrested. This picture here, there's some good footage here. I encourage you to watch it. But this picture is striking. This guy has become known as the Tiananmen Square Tank Man because we don't really have 100% verification. We really don't know to this day who he is for sure. There have been some names suggested, but nothing 100% verified. But this was a student who appeared to be holding 2 bags, grocery bags, maybe his jacket, who walked right out in the middle of the street and stood in front of these tanks, and the tank would move this way and that way, and he would get in front of it. And the tanks actually stopped for a while. They stopped coming in until there were two people came and got him out of there. It may have been government officials who got him out of there, but it's just one of those such a significant moment in world history that they have this one person standing in front of these tanks, like, get out of here, don't come in here. We just want democracy. It's just a powerful moment, and we really don't know what happened to him. People fear that maybe he was executed or imprisoned, but just as powerful. I encourage you to watch this clip when you get a chance. So some reform was occurring in China, but unfortunately this violent incident in which protesters were killed by a government that was still being quite repressive in 1989. Okay, back to the Soviet Union as we get into the early 90s here. What we're seeing with the Soviet Union is a dramatic increase in nationalism among Soviet republics, and I'll show you a map in a moment. But remember, the full name of the Soviet Union, it's called the USSR, which stands for United Soviet Socialist Republics, right? So you had Russia and then surrounding republics, kind of like we have the United States. They had a unification of republics, although maybe a little bit more of a forced unification than the United States, although we could debate that with the Civil War, I suppose. But these republics outside of Russia are starting to see an increase in nationalism. Nationalism means pride in one's nation, wanting to govern oneself, right? To be a nationalist is to want to govern oneself. You don't want to be ruled by anyone. So we see an increase in nationalism among Soviet republics. In December of 1991, with the reforms of Gorbachev, and Gorbachev perhaps encouraging this, 14 non-Russian republics declare their independence. I'm going to go to the page for a moment and show you this map. So what's going on is this. So this is Russia. Russia is a huge nation, right? The USSR, United Soviet Socialist Republics, was at one time all of this green. Okay, all of this green was the USSR. In 1991, all these nations are declaring their independence. They're leaving the USSR. These nations here in yellow, these were nations that were part of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet sphere of influence, Stalin's buffer zone. Remember, he wanted a buffer zone against Western invasion, so he did not allow free elections in these nations. They forcibly became part of the Warsaw Pact. These nations are declaring their independence in the early 90s. They're leaving, and Gorbachev is essentially giving them permission to. Czechoslovakia will dissolve and become the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Yugoslavia will devolve and break down into Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Albania, Macedonia, Montenegro, and there'll be some violence in here. As a matter of fact, the United States will send troops into Bosnia to stop an ethnic cleansing that occurs there under President Clinton. So not all of this dissolution was peaceful, of course, in this rise in nationalism, but we are seeing the breakup, or we see the breakup of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 90s. Okay, now Gorbachev, even though he had done all these great reforms and encouraged democracy and all that, he's forced to resign. He's forced to resign in 1991 due to a coup. He's actually overthrown from within that felt his democratic reforms are not going far enough. So he resigns. February 1992, President H.W. Bush and the new president of the Russia, no longer the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin, declare the Cold War over. And the Commonwealth of Independent States is formed. And that's what Russia is now. It's kind of similar to our Articles of Confederation. Okay, so it's no longer the Soviet Union. It's now called the Commonwealth of Independent States. All right. All right, I've got one section left in this lecture, but I'm going to mention several different countries within it. And you can tell, kids, I'm losing my voice. Okay, so other foreign policy events under Reagan and Bush, and I'm going to try and briefly spend a little bit more time on Iraq. Four countries I want to mention here: Nicaragua, Grenada, Panama, and Iraq. And once again, you can read more about these events in your digital text, chapter 17. Nicaragua, Grenada, and Panama are Central American nations. You can see Nicaragua here, Panama here, where the Panama Canal is, right? Grenada is actually a tiny island nation, but there'll be a U.S. involvement there, believe it or not. And then Iraq, of course, is over in the Middle East. Okay, Europe over here, Africa here, Asia, China, Soviet Union up here. Okay, or over here actually. All right. So what happens in these nations? Well, Nicaragua. First of all, Nicaragua is a place in which the U.S. had established a presence since 1912. President William Howard Taft had sent the U.S. Marines to protect U.S. investments there in 1912. It was his last year of his presidency. This was his dollar diplomacy, where the United States would send troops in to protect U.S. interests in Central and South America. In 1933, the United States actually assisted a dictator in coming to power, Anastasio Somoza, to come to power. He'll rule for 42 years. He'll manipulate elections. He'll assassinate political rivals. FDR actually will not support this. FDR will improve relations in Central and South America and the United States. But this happened right before he came into office. And sometimes the United States, unfortunately, supports dictators, particularly during the Cold War. 1977 through 1979, there's going to be a civil war in Nicaragua between Somoza's National Guard and the Sandinistas. Now, Sandinistas are a leftist rebel group. President Carter recognizes and sends aid to the new Sandinista regime after they topple the dictatorship. So even though the Sandinistas lean left, right, are known as perhaps being communists or having some Marxist influence, Carter recognizes them and actually supports them. There are different ways to do containment. It doesn't always have to be about sending in troops. Carter likes that the Sandinistas toppled a dictatorship that was known for human rights abuses. Remember, Carter is a human rights president, so he's showing some consistency here. He's not just blinded by the fact that these guys might be communists. He's more concerned about human rights. So he actually sends aid. He wants to build a relationship. Maybe this is something we should have done with Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam in the first place when he reached out to us. Carter's trying to do that with the Sandinistas here. 1981, Reagan's president, right? First year of his presidency. He has a more tougher stance against communism. He states that Nicaragua is a Soviet outpost. He is not going to support the Sandinistas. He's accusing Nicaragua of exporting revolution to other Central American countries. So he's going to cut aid to the Sandinistas, and he's going to throw his support behind a guerrilla force group known as the Contras. Okay, and this is going to lead to the Iran-Contra scandal. Now, some of you completed your essay about this on the last test and did a pretty good job on it, if I remember. It can be tricky to explain, but the Iran-Contra scandal is basically this. Reagan's trying to address two goals here. He wants to free U.S. hostages in Lebanon, and he wants to support the Contras, who he believes are fighting against communists in Nicaragua. So he's going to ship anti-tank missiles to Iran. Now, he's not just giving these to Iran, he's selling them to Iran. Bargain prices, right? But he's still going to sell them to Iran, and he wants to use that money to support the Contras. Now, the reason why he's giving weapons to Iran is during the 80s, they're in a 10-year war with Iraq, known as the Iran-Iraq War. So we're helping Iran, who we just had the Iranian hostage crisis with, against Iraq by selling them weapons. There's a goal here. We want to secure release of U.S. hostages from Lebanon. In Lebanon, a neighboring country to Iraq, west of Iran, borders the Mediterranean, south of Israel, if I'm remembering my geography correctly. There are U.S. hostages there being held by a terrorist group known as Hezbollah that Iran supports. So Reagan is hoping that by giving or selling weapons to Iran, they will influence the release of hostages in Lebanon. Interesting, because Reagan says the United States never negotiates with terrorists, and that's what he appears to be doing. But nevertheless, that's his goal. He wants to free these hostages. The Iranian weapons recipients stated that they would do everything in their power to secure the release of the hostages. Now, what does Reagan do with those funds? He diverts those funds to help fund the Contras fighting in Nicaragua. Now, what's the big deal, you might say? This is a violation of the Boland Amendment. The Boland Amendment had been passed by Congress because Congress was concerned about U.S. involvements in Central and South America, particularly those led by the CIA, where the CIA had shown a history of regime change, something that the United States says it doesn't do, but seems to do quite often, where we try to throw people out of power that we don't support and put people in that we do, whether the people in that country support that person or not. The Boland Amendment is violated by the Iran-Contra affair because those funds were sent to the Contras illegally. It was not approved by Congress. So this is going to lead to an investigation. Once again, most presidential scandals seem to involve presidents overstepping their bounds or not respecting the checks and balances that are in play. So Reagan or people working for Reagan, right, excuse me, ignored the conditions of the Boland Amendment and found a way to fund the Contras anyway. Okay, so congressional investigation occurs in 1987. This is literally threatening to take down the Reagan presidency. Is he going to be impeached? All that stuff. Doesn't happen. I don't know why this is here. Sorry about this, kids. We've already talked about the Boland Amendment. You know what? I'm going to get rid of that right now. The Iran-Contra affair had violated the Boland Amendment. Sorry for this, kids. So a congressional investigation occurred in 1987. Here's the thing. Reagan still is going to remain popular through all this because he's seen as fighting communism. The economy's going well. He's got that great personality. It's kind of similar to Clinton. Clinton has his own scandal with the Monica Lewinsky affair and all that, but Clinton remains popular in the 90s. Economy's going well. A lot of people supporting what he's doing. Reagan's management style is criticized here. The reason why impeachment proceedings don't go forward, it was difficult to put together any evidence that seemed to indicate that Reagan was directly involved here. So his management style was criticized, and that the people under him seemed to carry this out, and some of them faced some mild legal consequences, nothing really big. So he's criticized for this idea that these people carried this out without him supposedly knowing it. Now, there's some debate, and there are those who say that Reagan knew it. He just was able to get away with it because there wasn't enough direct evidence that's stating that he did know it. Of course, that's a subject of debate among Reagan supporters or detractors, typically, right? But it's much debate today. How much did Reagan actually know, and how much did he actually approve this? There wasn't enough to go forward with impeachment in this particular case, but many do consider it a pretty significant scandal, particularly since the Contras, even though this piece of propaganda is portraying them as heroic figures, the Contras turned out to be, drug dealers. They're involved in international drug trade. They tortured people they captured. They had some human rights. So, and what we're doing is we're interfering in these nations and we're telling them who we think should be in charge. And sometimes we're going against the will of the majority of the people there. So it's troubling. Grenada. Briefly mentioned this. President Reagan will send 2,000 troops to Grenada, which is an island in the Caribbean, in 1983. Showed you on that map earlier. This will be called Operation Urgent Fury. I like to give great titles to these, make it sound like a movie, I think, sometimes. Now, the purpose was to rescue American medical students there. There was basically a revolt going on in Grenada. There was a pro-Cuban government there, or a government that was becoming pro-Cuban, a government that was becoming Marxist, and Reagan wanted that government removed, and so he sent troops in to rescue American medical students, and not just a few of them. There are actually 600 American medical students studying at St. George's University in Grenada. Prominent university, beautiful island, why not go to school there, right? And then all this stuff went down. But what the United States really did was they overthrew a pro-Cuban government there, a government that was seen as being too communist. 18 American soldiers will be killed in that undertaking, and you can see their caskets here. And this is Ronald Reagan and his wife Nancy reviewing those caskets. Okay, now Panama. I'm getting there, kids. I'm almost done. In 1989, President Bush now will send 20,000 soldiers and Marines to overthrow dictator Manuel Noriega. Now, Manuel Noriega had been receiving money from the United States for a very long time, since about 1960 from the CIA, but basically Bush decided it was time to take him down because of his involvement in international drug trade. So he was literally taken by force by the U.S. military to Miami, where he stood trial and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Critics considered this an example of U.S. imperialism, but many Americans and Panamanians were pleased with the removal of a dictator involved in the drug trade. So mixed reviews once again, but not too unpopular move by President Bush. Of course, we wouldn't have issues with these drug trade if people just avoid drugs, right? Okay. All right. Last topic, and this is not as long as you think because it's the first Iraq War, and it's actually a relatively short one. Okay, so Saddam Hussein was president of Iraq from 1979 to 2003. I love all these presidents seem to stay in power forever. They call themselves presidents, and they're really dictators. The Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, a very long conflict, on and off 10-year conflict, left Iraq with enormous debts. So Saddam wants to do something about that. So he claimed that Kuwait, small country, borders Iraq. It would be to the east of Iraq. Okay, he stated that Kuwait was controlling a large portion of Iraqi oil. There was some dispute over some oil wells right on the border, whose was whose, and Saddam was using that as an excuse to evade Kuwait. And Saddam does have a significant military force in this time period. At the time, it was called the fourth best military in the world. So, August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi troops invade Kuwait. They conquer Kuwait rather quickly. Once again, significant military force. So they take Kuwait's oil fields, and now it looks like they're threatening Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a strong economic alliance with the United States. If Iraq conquered Saudi Arabia as well as Kuwait, it would literally control 1/2 of the world's oil reserves. This could severely threaten U.S. oil supplies. So this is seen as a threat to U.S. interests, but President George H.W. Bush is able to build a coalition here. Much of the world is concerned about Iraq, Saddam Hussein controlling too much of the world's oil. So January 16th of 1991, President Bush launched Operation Desert Storm to liberate Kuwait from Iraq. And this does occur with congressional approval. And it starts with a massive air assault. And this is very much a war that was on TV. I remember watching a lot of this war on TV on CNN back in the day. Okay, February 23rd, so let's see. So our air assault begins on January 16th. On February 23rd of 1991, there's a ground invasion launched from Saudi Arabia. And by February 28th, there's a ceasefire and Kuwait is liberated. So a pretty short conflict, right? Now, the decision is made not to overthrow Saddam Hussein. So George H.W. Bush stuck to his goal here. He said, hey, our goal is to liberate Kuwait. Once that's done, we're coming back home. So maybe a little bit more of a Vietnam syndrome here again, right? Where we don't want to get embroiled in a long, drawn-out conflict that we can't ever seem to get out of. Something that perhaps his son did not learn with Afghanistan and the second war in Iraq. Okay, so once again, while the Bush presidency has kind of risen in prestige in recent years, his mission was accomplished. They leave. They force Saddam Hussein to agree to UN weapons inspections, which seemed to be working even in 2003, because when the United States went in 2003, they did not find weapons of mass destruction. So the evaluation of Bush's presidency has improved over the years, and some of that is perhaps due to this decision. There were victory parades at home, and I think some of that was reconciliation over Vietnam. The American people wanted to make up for the fact that when troops came home from Vietnam, they weren't welcomed home. There were victory parades at home. Troops from Iraq were welcomed home. Now, there were fewer than 400 coalition casualties. This is a very successful military effort. There were only 400 U.S. casualties, as seen here. There were 100,000 Iraqi civilian and military deaths. We do know that many Gulf War veterans suffered from chemical exposure. What happened was some of the bombing that occurred from U.S. planes exploded Iraq chemical manufacturing plants, and some of those chemicals literally got in the air. Some of those were like, I want to say sarin gas, don't quote me on that, but some of those were chemicals that could be used in warfare, and our troops were exposed to those, and they suffered from that chemical exposure over the years, which is very tragic. Led to disabilities and things like that. But the sanctions that will be put in place will help eliminate Iraq's development of those weapons. And we're talking about United Nations sanctions here. Okay. Now, the sanctions and the UN inspections would be hard on the Iraqi people, though. There will be continuing health and economic issues for the Iraqi people because of those trade sanctions that occur upon Iraq. Okay, I can finally stop. Whew, I'm exhausted. Please comment on this lecture and provide a question. I look forward to responding to those. Thank you for your attention, kids.